The premise that consciousness exists within the brain, and once the brain is dead, there's nothing left after that. This suggests that that whole theory has to be rethought about. Whenever it comes to metaphysics, especially things like channeling or using intuition and all that sort of stuff, oftentimes people want to know, what is the science behind it? Has science looked at these things in some sort of open-minded, meaningful way, and what has it found? So when it comes to channeling, which is what we're going to talk about here today, and I got Arjun here to kind of dive through this together, there actually has been quite a bit of scientific studies and so forth that have gone on that have produced some very, very interesting results, especially when talking about tapping in or getting into sort of the paranormal a little bit. We kind of get into this a little bit more when we start looking at more of a recent study that kind of looks at some of the interesting things that have been measured from a random number generator perspective, which we're going to get into as well. Okay. But the key here is that there is absolutely a discussion that can be had from a scientific perspective when we're talking about channeling. And Arjun, I know you're going to remember from like a while ago, back in 2009, 10, 11, right? We used to write about metaphysical stuff, channeling, all these different things. And the complaint was always that there's never any good science. There's never anything to quantify or qualify what's actually happening within some of these metaphysical or paranormal ideas that really reveal the true nature of our reality, who we truly are, our consciousness, all that sort of stuff. And whereas now it's a very different time. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of science out there. There's a lot of things going on that are confirming what we pretty much know and feel intuitively, at least some of us. Yeah. And it's making a big difference as to how it's opening people up to what's the true nature of our reality at the end of the day.
Yeah, I've been you have too, been into channeling for a long time. And, it's something that's been practiced for thousands of years. The Oracle at Delphi is a popular example that many people might know about from ancient Greece. Yep. She was basically a channeler. Channeling is basically just another being from another world or another dimension or something, supposedly coming in and using the human body as a vessel, or simply through telepathic communication. And that's basically channeling. And yeah, like you said, nowadays there's a lot more open-mindedness, and a lot of people who have done channeling have gotten a lot of attention. Be it channeling extraterrestrial beings, this or that, but actual scientific studies have never really been publicized much as the actual channelers. Like channelers have been on news stations like we did.
Right.
Can't recall the name now, but the gentleman who channeled a supposed being from Venus.
Right.
And he was on the BBC, but that was mostly to make fun of him.
Right.
And today it's still ridiculed, but there's some very interesting studies on channeling that make it quite clear that something is going on. And even with some channelers, with regards to predictions and things they've said, things that have come true, I never really needed the studies to believe that it was authentic. Obviously, you have a lot of people who are fooling people out there, but I do believe that it's an actual real phenomenon, that dates thousands of years ago to now. And I do believe there are people who have that ability.
Yeah, and I think that's a discussion we're certainly going to get into in a second here after we dive through the science. Is kind of like the discernment and who is legit, and does the science mean that all channelers are quote unquote legit, or are, what are they really tapping into, and all that sort of stuff, which is totally a discussion that we're going to get into in a second here. But let's start with the science. Now I know you wrote an article a little bit back where it kind of looked at more of like from a people channeling people who were dead.
Yeah.
And seeing some very interesting corroborations.
So basically, this study looked at people who claim they can contact the deceased,
right?
Which is one form of channeling. So this is the deceased, and the study looked at, they used a number of individuals who were able to actually accurately report information on deceased people, and the study was done under double-blind conditions, and out of 4 of the mediums, 3 of them were able to provide accurate information on deceased person during supposed communication with the dead.
Right.
Now, what's interesting about the study is that it also noted during the time they were communicating with the dead, the brain activity was very significant in a specific area, the frontal theta area, it's called. So that was interesting. So there's different, a brain from a person channeling is different from a person who's not channeling.
Yeah, at least in those moments.
At least in those moments of channeling. And the fact that these people were able to bring up significant information about the deceased person who they had no idea about. They didn't know who they were. And this information was confirmed by relatives of that deceased person.
Right.
It's unbelievable if you think about it.
Absolutely. And, I would say it's unfortunate to some extent, because it's like it's unfortunate in the sense of like you have all of these sort of channelers out there, if you will, that are, saying all these different things and all this, sometimes it's just a repetition of the same thing over and over again. I remember that sometimes a trend that had been happening, especially leading up to 2012, is like every channeler was kind of just sort of repeating the same message. Not just each of them had a shared message, but they were every single time it was like the same thing.
And it seemed to be predictions over and over. And predictions, not to say that a lot of them aren't true, but a lot of these studies have nothing to, and these channelers use, they're like legit channelers, and you don't really see any predictions in them.
Right.
Like when they're channeling, it's just interesting messages, whether it's the deceased or a supposed extraterrestrial being. I found a lot of them when I was into, like, a lot of them would give predictions, and I think there was a lot of fakery there, but not with all of them. But like predictions hook people, and that's why they keep coming back. So
for sure,
you got to be careful when it comes to channeling.
And that's why there's the discussion from people who are skeptical, where it's like, they're preying on the emotions of people who want to hear the right thing and this, that, whatever. And it's like, unfortunately, like a lot of other things, we talk about this in the conspiracy world all the time, where it's like you'll have, some websites, some people out there that are sharing information from a conspiracy perspective that's just way out there, that doesn't have any evidence, it doesn't have anything that's going on, and it taints other discussions of the same thing that are credible and that are evidential. So it's like, it's almost like there's some that muddy the water, if you will. And I think that, part of what's so fascinating about just this study alone is it starts to bring up really interesting questions. It's like, okay, so if in fact these mediums are producing the same accurate information from deceased individuals, what does that say about the location of these individuals?
Right.
What does that say about consciousness?
Is it even the individuals, or is it like some form of their consciousness that's floating around somewhere in the ether, or is it?
Right.
Is it like, have they moved on, but a part of them there in that realm is there? There's so many questions.
Right. And I think this is why this information is not entirely, like, when people wonder, like, it's not just they don't want people to know sort of thing. It's like this sort of information sometimes, to a mainstream type mind, especially a mainstream scientific mind, it starts the idea that the premise that consciousness exists within the brain, and once the brain is dead, there's nothing left after that. This suggests that whole theory has to be rethought about, right? Or at least that you have to fit this somehow within that theory, and it becomes very difficult to do so, because you've already stated that the brain it's shut off. It's like you've turned off the radio, it's gone. But what this is proving is that, that radio is still on. Yeah. And something's going on there. And so it's fascinating the amount we're sort of seeing this stuff come up and sort of validate a lot of the things that we intuitively know about ourselves.
It's this is just channeling, like it's one of many studies that suggest consciousness somehow, or aspects of consciousness, carry on after death.
This idea that scientists, or that there's not a large group of scientists that are studying the paranormal, the supernatural, and some of these more fringe ideas and getting into the post-material world, there's way more people that are welcoming and ushering in, from a scientific perspective, the post-material world than the mainstream would have people think.